pause? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to NDS Week. This is the first event. Unfortunately, we had to cancel some of our previous ones due to the shutdown, which has affected, the defense and security nexus. But despite that, we're here, and we're really looking forward to having you to learn a little bit about how defense and security has shaped Purdue and what that means for us going forward. Please stay tuned for events throughout the week. At www.ndsweek.org is where you can go to learn more information. We're extremely excited to have both Dr. Moser and Mr. Abel coming forward for presentations today, and I'll hand it over to Adriana, who's going to tell you a little bit more about who we have.
Thank you, Grace. So our first speaker today is Dr. Joel Moser. He was the United States Space Force Director of Science, Technology, and Research at the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia. He served as the central lead for all science and technology matters for the organization, which comprises approximately 11,000 space professionals worldwide and manages a global network of satellite command and control, communications, missile warning, and launch facilities. In this role, he developed long-term military requirements for the Space Force and interacted with other principals, operational commanders, combatant commands, acquisition, and international communities to address cross-organizational science and technical issues and solutions. Dr. Moser represented U.S. Space Force science and technology on decisions, high-level planning, and policy, building coalitions and alliances throughout the U.S. government, industry, academia, the international community, and other scientific and technology organizations. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Moser to the stage.
Thank you, Adriana. Happy to be here. I guess I don't need this. I'm good. All right, well, thanks. I'm happy to be here. The biography, I started out life as a scientist. I'm trained as a scientist, but as you can see from the screen, I call myself a futurist these days. And I think that's what science is all about, is the future. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and assuming I can control this. One of my hobbies is as a beekeeper. I have a lot of weird hobbies, and there's just a lot that we can learn from bees. The bees are fascinating. I could give a whole talk on the behaviors of bees. But one of them, and you've probably seen this, is bees have this communication mechanism. So when one bee finds a stash of nectar and pollen somewhere, she can come back to the hive and do a little wiggle dance that points the direction and distance, and there's all this complex information in it. For the rest of the field bees, and there are other bees with different jobs in a colony, but I won't get into those. For the rest of those field bees, that's important information. They go off and they go the direction that they were guided, and they find the pollen and bring back stores. But those are the exploiters. Those are the bees that go do what they're told. They're pretty confident they're going to find what they find out there and bring it back. About 5 or 10% of the bees the field bees in the hive don't do that. They don't follow the dance, the leader. They go off and go somewhere else, and they start exploring the other surroundings because they're looking for another big cache of honey and pollen, and hopefully they'll find one and come back. That's an important thing. There's exploiters in there that are exploiting the information and going and getting the low-risk nectar. And then there's the others that are taking a broad list because they know there's plausibility of other stashes of honey out there, or nectar, and they're going to go find those. That's kind of what I'm talking about in this talk, is those honeybees that go off and explore, not knowing what they're going to find, but knowing that there's the plausibility of big payoff. So as the title said, I'm going to talk about dynamic space operations, or DSO. Dynamic space operations is it's a term that the Space Force is grappling with right now. The Mitchell Institute came out with a paper just last Friday, kind of trying to define what that means to the military to have dynamic space operations and how it's going to be game-changing. My definition's a little different, and it's related to, at the turn of the 20th century, goods and material and people moved largely in the U.S. by locomotive. And locomotives are, they're big, impressive technologies, but they're not very dynamic. You can predict where a locomotive's going to be tomorrow, a week from now, a month from now. And in fact, what you see there is the conductor synchronizing his railroad-grade pocket watch, the P&T technology of the time, with the others so that they can be on schedule. That's how we used to do transportation of goods. People waited on trains. Trains did not wait on people. They didn't, unless there was a big weather event or a train holdup or something like that, they're going to be on schedule. Compare that to today, and this is a picture of the port of Long Beach, modern times. This is how we move goods and logistics and people today. It's a buzzing beehive of activity. At the port of Long Beach alone, there's roughly 5 million cargo containers that come in every year, and they're transported from ships to rail to trucks to airplanes. Each one of them is tagged with a different destination. The logistics surge and swell depending on the needs for the products that the containers contain. And we built an entire economy around this. We have things like just-in-time production, where we produce material assuming that the logistics supply chain is going to bring us the materials that we need just when we need it, and take the materials to market that we've produced. This is today's dynamic logistics network, and I would say it's kind of a living, breathing, you can't really predict what it's going to be doing tomorrow or the next day because it's going to change, depend on demand. That's the way we're going to move from space. Today, space is a relatively static operation. Just imagine we have lots of geosynchronous satellite communication birds or GPS satellites in mid-Earth orbit, or even Starlinks in low Earth orbit. Those are all doing things that we know what they're going to be doing tomorrow, the next day, and the day after that. Yeah, the traffic that they transmit will be dynamically routed, but basically the space operation will be the same tomorrow as it is today. But that could be different in the future. We expect that we will move from a relatively static space environment to one where it looks a little bit more like the Port of Long Beach. And keep that image in your mind, because I'm going to talk about it again. And so dynamic space operations are defined sort of as unpredictable, rapidly replanned activities in space that demand real-time responsiveness. So what do I really mean by that? Here's just sort of a table, a checkbox to determine what's dynamic, what isn't. So again, if it can be planned days, weeks, or months in advance, that's probably not DSO. If you have to frequently replan it, maybe it's starting to touch into this DSO, but maybe not. It depends on the nature of the replanning and where it comes from. But if it has to rapidly adjust to environmental changes or discovery of new resources or some adversary behavior, and you have to do that frequently, then maybe it's probably in this dynamic space operations catalog. If it has to rely on decision-making that happens at tactical speeds, changes all the time, more than a human reaction alone, probably. If it's supporting an inherently flexible mission, you get the picture. It's hard to define what's dynamic versus what isn't dynamic, but if it looks a lot like this living, breathing Port of Long Beach, then it's probably dynamic. And there's some things that we do today. I mentioned geosynchronous comms, predictable GPS, big telescopes doing sky surveys. Those are not really dynamic. But if we had satellite swarms that are retasked to go off and deal with an adversary satellite, or to deal with some crisis, even if it's, say, a crisis on Earth and you need surveillance satellites moved over there, that's starting to get there. Servicing fleets, we're just now starting in the Space Force to talk about things like refueling and replenishment and reservicing. We can quickly move into a dynamic operation there. Robotic asteroid miners. If we start figuring out how to reap the benefits of rare earth minerals and platinum group metals and other things that are abundant in space objects and bringing them down, that's going to drive an economy that's going to be very dynamic. So we have really one within the Space Force one mission area where we have something that's approaching dynamic space operations. And this is a satellite constellation called GSAP, the Geosynchronous Space Awareness Program. And GSAP was flown starting about in 2013. There are 8 of these satellites in total. What they are basically flying cameras. So if something happens in space and you need to go inspect another satellite, say something fails, and you want to go take pictures of that failed satellite to see what happened, you would send a GSAP over, and it could do some rendezvous and proximity operations, fly around it autonomously, take pictures, report back. Obviously, the reason the Space Force is doing this is if an adversary launches a satellite and we don't know what that satellite does, we're going to go over and check it out and fly around and try to understand what the capabilities of that satellite are. Well, that's sort of the first foray in dynamic space operations. And I will tell you, we were just about to decommission the last of those because guess what? They ran out of fuel. We don't have any way to fill them back up. They had a certain amount of fuel on board when we launched them. Every time we used them, we used a little bit of that fuel, and that shortened the mission lifetime. So commanders at U.S. Space Command had to think, is it important enough for me to send my satellite over to do a rendezvous and proximity operation with whatever it is? Because it's gonna, that's gonna be some of my finite lifetime. What we would like to do is take that constraint away. If we had a way to refuel or replenish these, then the commanders wouldn't have to make that decision. It would take that decision off the table. They could just use it whenever they needed to. That would be a dynamic space operations world. We're not there yet. We're moving in that direction. But as a futurist, one of the things that I like to do and other futurists like to do is let's take that to the plausible extremes. Let's take moving in baby steps toward the dynamic space operations world to a world where space looks a lot like the Port of Long Beach, where there's things moving in and out and refueling and transporting and surging and waning depending on mission needs and supply and demand. It's something that looks like this. And not just for military, but for commerce too. That would be a dynamic space in my mind. And the way a futurist looks at this is to look, what's the extreme edge of plausibility of such a thing? What about this would violate the laws of physics, for example? And you go right up to that edge, that extreme, and you start thinking about, well, what would the world be like if we had dynamic space operations that look kind of like this? And that's what I'm going to spend the rest of this talk talking about, is what would a future on the edge look like? So there is a problem with this dynamic operations and the supply chain and logistics that we have today. You remember back at the COVID, what happened to our supply chains and things like the Port of Long Beach? We had all kinds of problems, right? The cost of moving a sea container went to a little more than $10,000 a container. They call them 40-foot equivalent units. That's 7 times larger than the nominal amount in 2019, which is about $1,400. We had schedule reliability problems. Remember the pictures of ships lined up outside of the Port of Long Beach waiting to come in because they didn't have the capacity to do it. Things would sit on a truck for an average of 8 days or on a rail for averages 16 days before they could even move. No matter what you look at, the metrics weren't bad during that period of time because our logistics chains, our supply chains are not resilient, they're vulnerable. And so nobody had thought what would happen during a global pandemic when the world kind of shuts down, what would happen to those supply chains, and it made it worse. Remember the runs on toilet paper and all those crazy things that were going on. So the problem with this complex, dynamic, living, breathing organism is that it can often not be resilient. When things are going well, when everything's working nominally, the tendency of our markets and capital is to optimize that. So we tweak every little parameter so that it's operating at maximum efficiency. That's where just-in-time production comes from, is trying to optimize and efficient. But when something bad happens, the whole institution comes crashing down. And that's what we're trying to avoid. And that's why I say scientists are futurists. We're thinking about what is this world of dynamic space operations and what would make it not resilient? What kind of threats would be out there that would affect the ability to do things? So one more point about COVID. So this is just a plot of a metric. It's called the containerized freight index. You can kind of think about it as the amount of money required to move goods globally in sea containers. So during peaceful, normal times before COVID, this containerized index was sitting about 750. And then in July of 2020, you can see it popped up and was that way really until the end of COVID was declared in 2023. Just a way to visualize the magnitude of the impact. Notice it never did come quite back down to baseline levels because we had to figure out how to make it more resilient. So that's COVID. What's this thing? Does anybody know? So it starts in 2024 and goes for about a year to the beginning of 2025. Yeah. Say that again. You're right. That's exactly right. It's the Houthis attacking vessels and transportation out of Yemen into the Red Sea. So the first example was a global pandemic that affected everything. The second example is just a few guys that found a strategic choke point and screwed up almost to the same magnitude as COVID for shorter time. And the reason that happened is because they basically turned off this shipping route that goes through the Red Sea, and so everything had to go around the tip of Africa. It slowed things down, caused the same sort of delays and prices. And for about a 6-month period, there were 60 attacks on shipping, commercial shipping in the Red Sea. That's another example where a single small group can affect this living, breathing operation. So what was the role of the Navy in this? So how did we get past this? You don't hear about shipping in the Red Sea and problems with the Houthis today. What happened was a coalition of navies, including the U.S., banded together and created an operation called Operation Prosperity Guardian, where they started escorting ships through the Red Sea, and it basically solved the problem. There's still some activity there, but that's an example of the Navy doing work to protect commercial activity, civilian traffic on the high seas. I want to plant a seed in your mind. Does the Space Force do that kind of thing? Does the Air Force do that kind of thing? It's a question, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So let's talk about how this world can evolve. So I like to think about the future as a balloon. We start at the present. We know what we can do today, what capabilities we have, what missions, what is in existence, but they're going to grow. And it grows because of technology and learning and things that we know. And because technology creates more technologies, it grows exponentially. So that's why I depict it as a balloon growing bigger and bigger. And if we think of these two, an uncertainty is just something that we don't know about the future. And these are two uncertainties that I'd like to explore a little more. One is the future of this thing that we're calling dynamic space operations. And the other is the future of contested space. And by that I mean military contested space. Historically, there's been some saber rattling in space, and yes, China's sending up things that could mess with our satellites. But there's not all-out warfare in space today. but we've declared space as a warfighting domain. NATO now recognizes it as a warfighting domain. We're preparing for a world where space is valuable enough territory that military conflict could play out. So what happens when those two things merge? The growth of dynamic space operations and the growth of military contestation in space. That is just one scenario of what could happen. You know, I don't know if we're going to end up with dynamic space operations like the Port of Long Beach or not, and I don't know if the military is going to look that way. But we want to look at that overlapping region. And the other thing, you know, Arthur C. Clarke said, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. James Dater said, a useful statement about the future should at first seem ridiculous. Albert Einstein said, if the idea is not absurd, then there's no hope for it. What are they saying? They're saying it's hard to predict the future. You know, and technology in particular is hard to predict where it's going to go. And we don't have, our little human linear minds aren't very good at imagining the expansive new world that is allowed by technology. Just think of the smartphone 20 years ago. Who would imagine that we'd all have a supercomputer in our pocket, which, by the way, is a distributed weapon of mass destruction. Lots of things could happen bad with those kind of things. So I call that the Clarke-Dater boundary, after James Dater and Arthur C. Clarke. That's when you're thinking right on the edge, you know, as much on the edge of the laws of physics or plausibility as you can think. You put those on in the gonculator to consider what the future might look like. Because if you don't do that, you're going to miss big aspects of the future, big pieces of things that happen on the future. So keep that in mind. So, you know, if you think about what the implications of this dynamic space operations across the phases of war, so, you know, during peacetime, if you had dynamic space operations, you'd be frequently retasking satellites to get the ISR that you needed. You'd be doing some refueling. Things like GSAP would last forever or longer because we'd be able to do that. All those things would happen during peacetime and could be good things. During sort of the escalatory, the gray zone, where you don't really know if you have open conflict or not, frequent maneuvers can really start to confuse your adversary. Are they posturing to moving to prepare for attack, or is that a peaceful move? And you create some uncertainty with dynamic space. Of course, as you move up to crisis escalation, you know, the tempo compresses. You can use dynamic space operation to blunt attacks or to, you know, there's going to be a lot more fog of war and uncertainty going on. And during full-scale warfare, you know, it's an active maneuver battle space. Things are moving around, trying to jig and jang and just distract the adversary at every move. So, can we agree that DSO at least could have a potential impact on all the phases of warfare? Okay, so I would say yes. So this is a very important chart, and I'll spend a little bit of time on this. So we've defined two critical uncertainties about the future: the level of dynamic space operations and the amount of military contestation in space. So if you come up with the best case and the worst case scenarios for each of those, you know, for dynamic space operations, the best case could be that vibrant, living, Long Beach-like port in the sky. The worst case could be nothing at all happens in dynamic space operations. We just continue to have static operations, or maybe even worse. Maybe with all the satellites that we're putting up today, we have a Kessler syndrome and runaway breakdown in space, and we basically make it unusable for anybody. That's physically possible. People have postulated that for years. So maybe that's the worst case. For contestation in space, maybe we break out in rampant peace in space and everybody sings Kumbaya and we're never going to fight anything in space. Or it could go the other way. It could be the worst case. Well, if you plot those two things, you know, dynamic space operations on the x-axis, military contestation, you've defined 4 quadrants now that really define four very different, distinct scenarios of the future. So for example, let's look at this quadrant one, which is low dynamic space operations, but peaceful space. That's kind of what we've been living since the beginning of the space era, more or less. We're not doing much dynamic, there's no war out there. Okay, we can describe that one pretty easy. But what if we have high DSO in peaceful space? So we figure out how to mine asteroids or manufacture new pharmaceuticals in space, and we have this very dynamic, living, breathing commercial occupation in space that's very dynamic. That's a scenario. And we've figured out how to limit the military contestation, so it's all very, very relatively peaceful and happy. But then you can look at the other end where you have high contestation in space, and those are very different scenarios. So think about this one here, low DSO and worst case on military contestation. That's, I'll tell you, is what the Space Force is by default planning for today. We're just assuming that commerce is going to not figure out how to build things and make money in space, but we know that it's a very sensitive target for our adversaries because it provides all of our communications and the things that make us great. So a lot of our efforts planning on this. But what if you have both? What if you have this vibrant commercial economy moving in stuff back and forth, and you have military contestation? Now you have a little bit of mix. And what futurists do is they take these kind of scenarios and they describe them. And they just describe them in words, create a document that describes what would a world look like in each of those four. And you take it as close to the Clark-Dater boundary as possible, as far to the corners of plausibility. And you just think through this. And when we did this, when I was a chief scientist of Space Force, we did this all the time. We would actually enlist the services of science fiction writers to come in and help us think through this. We had Orson Scott Card was one of our Ender's Game fame, came in and helped us think through this. And let me just to give you an example of what they look like, let's think of this one right here. So lots of vibrant commercial activity, wealth streams being made in space, very dynamic. We're moving material up and down, we're manufacturing, but there's a military contest going on, and it's a very dangerous place to be. Let me just, if I can get into my thing here, let me just describe a couple of paragraphs of what that scenario would look like. So this is for the period 2035 to 2045, so roughly 10 to 20 years from now. By the mid-2030s, space no longer resembles the serene vacuum of early exploration. It is a dynamic arena where satellites swarm, refuel, and reposition continuously. Propulsion innovations like hybrid plasma nuclear thrusters and autonomous fuel depots have rendered fixed orbits obsolete. The once predictable sky now churns with motion, maneuver clouds drifting above the Earth, shimmering tapestries of intention and uncertainty. Autonomy rules these lanes. Artificial intelligence execute microsecond thruster burns, negotiating among themselves to avert collisions. Humans supervise from intent governance consoles, interpreting AI visualizations rather than joystick commands. Guardians train in cognitive machine empathy. There's a concept for you. Learning when an algorithm's maneuver is a defensive prudence or aggressive signaling. In this era, deterrence is kinetic choreography. So let me just read a couple more paragraphs. From a geopolitical view, what does that mean? Nations have transformed orbital maneuvering into strategic language. Close approaches substitute for missile test. Positional parity replaces numerical parity. Shadow fleets mirror adversaries to signal readiness without firing a shot. Yet the boundary between demonstration and provocation erodes when an autonomous craft darts unexpectedly. War rooms debate whether a machine's reflex might ignite human conflict. That sounds pretty scary. One more, I'll give you the economic perspective of this world. Economics evolves to survive volatility. Conventional insurance implode after the first wave of uncontrolled collisions, but market ingenuity birthed new instruments. Mobility credits grant rights to maneuver within congested zones. Transparency tokens on distributed ledgers verify adherence to agreed upon orbital corridors. After the catastrophic 2041 debris cascade, transparency became its own currency. Entities that shared telemetry joined a collective risk pool, lowering premiums through openness. Still, secrecy remains a weapon. Not every orbit can be audited. And it goes on, and it talks about not only the social, the economic, the political, the legal, the ethical aspects of the future. And the importance of such a scenario is that it be very complete to talk about all of those things. It needs to be complex, so one area needs to influence another. It needs to be self-consistent, so you can't have anything, one place that says X, the other place that says Y. That won't work in these scenarios. Because what you do with those, once you've fully developed a scenario like that, you can then do war games in there. You can have a dilemma. So what happens if an adversary attacks a shipping lane, like think about the Houthis in the Red Sea? How would you work through that? What would you like to have? What capabilities would you like to have at your disposal in order to address that problem or vignette? So just like we war game things today, this would be war gaming something in a synthetic future that we created. And what that tells you is if you do that across multiple scenarios, there might be a few common things that you might like exquisite space domain awareness, when you want to be able to know where everything is at a given time. And that's how I use this kind of strategic foresight when I was the chief scientist, because it helped me prioritize scientific investment. Because think about it, the things that our scientists are working on, if you go to a laboratory around here, things sitting on a lab bench today might be 10 or 20 years before they reach maturity to be used as a piece of military kit. Well, if you turn that around, that means you have to think about the uses 20 years from now in order to know what to invest in today in terms of science and technology, so you can be ahead of the curve when the time comes. So that's the key uncertainty multiple futures chart. So taking this a little further, how do one of the advantages of going through that process of creating multiple future scenarios and thinking through what the implications would be is it allows you to have worked through, change your mental model so that when you see something happening in the real world, you can put it in the context of, well, in this scenario that we created, this happened. So you have trends and indicators of things that you can see happening. So, today we have somewhat of a proliferation of agile constellations. We're flying more satellites that can maneuver and do things and do rendezvous and proximity operations. We're starting to see some steps towards on-orbit servicing and logistics. Northrop Grumman's done three or so tests of their servicing vehicle. The DoD's done a little bit of that. We're doing more autonomy. Do you know how many people run a Starlink constellation? It's a small handful in a van. It's not a lot of people. That's all done with a lot of autonomy. We're seeing commercial militarization of space. By that I mean we're using the commercial technologies like Starlink to put things like Starshield, which is a military version of Starlink, in the same thing. So we're using that commercial innovation to do that. And space traffic management is becoming a big thing. We used to talk about a few hundred objects in space that we had to keep track of. Now there's tens of thousands of things in space, things like Starlinks that we have to make sure that they don't collide. So that's becoming a big thing. So how do you know that we're moving, though, even further into this area of dynamic space operations? These are things for us all to watch for. If we see some of these things, we know we're moving that direction. We see a lot more maneuvers. That's an indication. If we see swarms of satellites being developed to do whatever kinds of things, launch has a play in this. So if we figure out how to very low cost launch to get new things into orbit. So think back to that GSAP example that I talked about. I said refueling is one way to extend the life. That's only one way. Another way is, well, you just send up a bunch more when you use all the fuel on the early one. So low cost replenishment could also be a way to extend the life. If you start seeing military doctrine published around DSO, and there's a few indicators of that happening today. As I said, last week, the Mitchell Institute published a paper on dynamic space operations, what it means for the Space Force. A big one to look at, and a lot of people don't think about, is the insurance company. Insurers spend a lot of analysis trying to think about, well, how much they can insure a satellite for, because satellites represent billions of dollars a day of data sometimes. But if they start putting into their calculus maneuverability as part of their, will they insure it or not, or how much maneuverability in their orbit, then that's an indicator. And then discovery of new resources or wealth streams. If we find ways to make money in space that are new and novel and create wealth streams, then we're probably moving in that dynamic space operations. And I'd like to study that last one a little bit more. So, I used to get pitches from all kinds of companies talking about their grand plans. Entrepreneurs are great at thinking about possibilities of the future. This is a company called TransAstra. The CEO is a friend of mine, Joel Sercel. And his thing is mining asteroids and near-Earth objects for their rare earth materials, their platinum group minerals. And this is just simply a plot of how many of those things that we've seen over time. And you can see there's a couple of jumps in there. What are those? Those are new telescope systems that have been developed, so we have a better ability to find these things. Some of these are what are called NHATS, which is a tortured acronym, Near Earth Asteroid Human Accessible Targets. I think I've written wrong there. Those are just ones that we have enough energy and they're not so far that we can't get there to do something about. And the number of those growing, and this company, TransAstra, is betting the farm on the ability to go get those. In fact, in 2028, he's got a mission to go rendezvous with his first one. He's got a big capture bag that the Space Force is paying for that can capture an asteroid and then they can be mined. In fact, they've defined a new term, and you probably won't hear about in your astrodynamics classes, called Terran space. It's basically the Earth-Moon gravity well. So all the region of space where the Earth and the Moon play a significant role in gravity goes out to about 1.5 million kilometers from the Earth. And right at that, what he's calling the rim area, they're starting to discover a lot of asteroids trapped in that area. So it's just beyond Earth-Moon L1 Lagrange point. They've discovered something like 500 smallish asteroids that are mineable. They're within human grasp to get to. It's just a few day trek out there. And the other good thing about when you're in this rim area is you're in sort of a super high rate. With very low delta V, you can move around that space and go from asteroid to asteroid, and you can access any other part of the Earth-Moon gravity well. So if you want to send that material down to the Earth, you can do that. This is pretty exciting to me. This is not science fiction. This is real. It's out there. It's within our technical grasp to get there. In fact, as I mentioned, just 2 years from now, in 2028, they have a mission plan to go rendezvous with one of those asteroids on a private venture to mine it and bring it back. If those things are successful, that's a pretty good step towards this dynamic space operations, because if you can get valuable resources in space cheaper than you can get them at the Earth, then you're in great shape. So this is a picture of what he calls New Moon. This is the capture bag where he captures some asteroids, and he has autonomous capability to extract the rare earth minerals and do things. Pretty exciting. Looks a lot like that AI rendered thing that I started with. And it's just a couple of years away. So these are all indicators that we are moving towards this grander dynamic space operations. Okay, one last point. And this goes back to the Houthis in the Red Sea and the attacks that happened, and the Navy participating in protecting lines of commerce. So the naval strategist and historian, he wrote a famous book, The Influence of Sea Power on History. It's required reading if you're a military historian major. Alfred Thayer Mahan said, "The necessity of a navy in the restricted sense of the word springs from the existence of peaceful shipping and disappears with it." His argument was, the only reason you would need a navy if you're not protecting shipping is if you're a case of a nation which has aggressive tendencies and keeps up a navy merely as a branch of the military establishment. So we demonstrated with the Operation Prosperity Guardian that the Navy can reduce the delays in global shipping due to a terrorist activity by just escorting and defending the commercial ships. So the Navy is practicing this Mahanian theory. What does the Space Force do in that area? When the Space Force was stood up in 2019, and I was there, I was part of these discussions, it was given a set of missions. One of them was to support the joint force. That means look down and support the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and marine that are executing operations with communications and the like. To provide for capabilities in, through, and from space, so to provide the capabilities that we provide to the joint warfighters. And there was a third one that doesn't get talked about too much, which is to protect U.S. interests in space. I can tell you, we're not spending a lot of time protecting commerce in space with the Space Force. But if this world of dynamic space operation does play out, like we've just described, the Space Force darn well better figure out how to do that, because that's critically important. So we call it the dual mandate of the Space Force. So we have the look-down mandate to support the joint fighter, to provide comms, the PNT, and all those things. But there's this other mandate that's to look up and support a virtuous cycle. So what happens if a military secures a domain, like the Navy securing the Red Sea? Then commerce can happen, and you get increased tax revenue, which pays for more navies or space forces, which allows you to secure the domains more. It's a virtuous cycle. It's a feedback loop. That's a completely different world than the Space Force is planning for today. And that's why you go through these multiple futures to think through, what are we missing? What would we be surprised by if this world of dynamic space operations does come to be? So, just in conclusion, in space operations, whether they grow or not, are going to define the next 20 years in space. It could be positive or negative. It kind of depends on what we do to prepare for it. DSO growth, AI, I haven't talked a whole lot about AI, but that's part of this too, and military contestations. There are uncertainties that we need to look about and try to understand what are the range of plausible futures. Not the possible or the most likely futures, but what's plausible. And, we kind of send it where terrestrial logic's, going back to the picture of the railroad, where we were in 1910, that's where we are today in space. Where we go could really transform it. And I think places like Purdue are central to the talent and innovation. There's places like here that can think through to develop these scenarios, to do the war gamings, to lead turn, because I can guarantee you the Space Force isn't spending much time thinking about fictitious scenarios of the future. But it's vitally important that somebody do and think through the strategies and the tactics and the capabilities that need to be developed today. And, my call to action is wherever you can in your career, think about this process of strategic foresight in using multiple futures. It's an excellent way to expose weaknesses, to think through what might happen, give yourself a lot of what ifs. So it's a very powerful tool. If you ever want to hear more about it or learn more about it, please reach out to me. There's my LinkedIn profile. And thank you very much. I'm interested in your thoughts if we have any time for questions.
Round of applause for Dr. Moser, please.
Thanks.
Now we're going to transition into Q&A. So does anybody have any questions?
Yeah.
Hi, that was an excellent talk. I've maybe think about what would happen if, the GPS system went down. If someone could take out those satellites, like everyone in LA would get lost forever, and that would stop commerce everywhere.
That's right. Not to mention the fact that our ATMs and our market systems are tied to PNT timing, come from GPS satellites. That's one of the reasons we're so worried about the resilience of space right now, and that's a perfect example. GPS satellites, if they were attacked, it would have the potential of bringing our whole economy to its knees, at least for a time, until we could deal with it. Hopefully we don't have to live that world, but it's one of the worlds that our adversaries are certainly looking at. Good point.
Any more questions?
With the real power that nuclear weapons have in space, how would you see these distributed operations, these advanced maneuver techniques to potentially counter WMDs in space because they are so powerful?
Yeah. Well, that's a whole complex set of issues, right? So, first of all, it doesn't take a very sophisticated nation to launch a nuke into low Earth orbit and detonate it and wipe out LEO satellites for the next 100 years or whatever with the radiation belts that are formed. So there's that problem. There's the problem of positioning weapons of mass destruction in space. And we have things like the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 that says thou shalt not put WMDs in space, but how long is that going to last? Right up until somebody decides it's in their interest to do that. So those are the policy and legal and ethical considerations that go into the future. And that's why I say when you create these scenarios, can't just think about the military perspective. You got to think about the full range of things and all the tools of warfare that we have available to us. But you're right, that's a very big worry. And I can imagine if the world looked like, I keep calling it the Port of Long Beach in space with all this activity going in there, it could be hidden. You can hide weapons of mass destruction. But I'll ask you this, why can't you hide weapons of mass destruction in the actual Port of Long Beach in a sea container? It's a big problem. I don't have a solution. Yeah, thanks. Any other thoughts?
Let me just preface by saying I wasn't here for your whole talk, so hopefully I'm not asking questions that were already answered. But at least for me growing up, I thought it was really cool to see how, different countries have collaborated on things like the ISS and stuff like that. So I'm just curious, how do you think something like, a militaristic space force fits in with a lot of collaboration and research and all these very, I would say, peaceful operations that we've had successfully in the past?
That's an excellent question. I'm glad you asked it. And so we stand, like I say on the chart, at a crossroads. So if you're a military decision maker in the Space Force, do you invest in this dynamic space operations or not? And I'll tell you what, we're kind of stuck in the mud right now because the question we ask is, well, is the commercial industry to produce that capability going to exist or not? And if I'm a commercial entrepreneur wanting to develop a new asteroid mining or pharmaceutical development in space, I'm asking the question, is the military going to invest in the logistics and the security needed to do that? So we're kind of at a chicken and the egg. Somebody's going to move first. What you're pointing out is a collaboration could go a long ways. If we figured out, if you take the point of view that our economy is the strongest determiner of national security, we've had presidents from both the parties say that, then we want, as a nation, to develop peaceful commerce along this virtuous cycle. And so we should develop alliances even within the U.S., between our military developers and our commercial developers so that we can both have what we want, which is this vibrant economy that has security. And then you bring in our partners and allies to do that too. And that's sort of what the Artemis Accords are all about, and particularly going back to the moon is pulling in our friends to help. But that's the key, is we can't think about it in silos. We can't have the military going it alone and doing their own thing, the commercial markets going their own way, and individual countries going their own way. That's not the path to success here. So great question. Great geopolitical, geostrategic question. So.
Do we have any other questions?
So you mentioned that there are like 4 possible outcomes to a future in space. One with like best case scenario for warfighting, worst case scenario for warfighting, best case scenario for dynamic operations, and worst case scenario for dynamic operations.
Yep.
Is there a preferred future for the Space Force, and are they trying to guide the future in that direction?
Yeah, that's an excellent question too. And my stock answer to that is no. We're not defining it this way because we want to move in one of the directions. It's really about, if the world moves in that direction, are we prepared for it? However, there are certainly good scenarios in there and bad scenarios for the U.S., and we would want to push towards the positive ones and away from the negative ones. So by going through that process and plotting those axes, at least for those 2 uncertainties, that gives you some targets to push towards. So we would like to have a world with low military contestation and high DSO. What investments or policies or governance issues would we like to work out today that moves us in that direction and away from the others? So it's useful for that too. Thanks.
Do we have any more questions for Dr. Moser? Okay.
All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Moser. Our next guest speaker is retired Lieutenant Colonel Brandon Kane-Abel. He is an experienced experimental test pilot and current flight test captain for United Airlines. While serving in the United States Air Force, he directed the Joint Center for Electromagnetic Readiness for United States Strategic Command and commanded a flight test squadron, conducting high-priority flight test programs, overseeing $2.5 billion in unique national assets. Starting his career as an AAE graduate of Purdue University, Brandon became an F-15C instructor pilot, supporting Operation Noble Eagle. His distinguished service includes over 500 combat hours as an evaluator pilot in the E-11A for Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan, lead F-16 experimental test pilot for the Automatic Ground Collision Avoidance System, and Director of Operations for the United States Air Force Test Pilot School. He has accumulated over 4,800 flight hours in over 110 different aircraft. Please join me in welcoming Lieutenant Colonel Brandon Kane-Abel. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, thank you. Whoa. Is there a volume, or is that good enough? All right. Yeah, thank you for having me here today. It's really an honor to come back and talk, and this is the first time I've been in this building. When I went to school here in the aeronautical engineering, it was over at Grissom Hall, which was much different, so it's very cool to see. But I'll give you just a little bit about my background, kind of how I got to Purdue, actually. Talk about one of the programs that is near and dear to my heart, hopefully simulate some questions, and feel free, at the end, ask questions on some of my biography that I don't necessarily talk about here today. And then in the last 10 minutes or so, just giving some lessons learned that I learned throughout my career, specifically with this program, and maybe just a couple words of wisdom. Take it for what it's worth, but I guess I click here. A quick disclaimer. So retired Air Force officer and current employee of United Airlines. what I say here today is kind of my views, and they don't necessarily represent the DoD. Actually, Department of War, I forgot it's changed, the components, and then United Airlines itself. All right, so this is my great uncle. He actually got his first airplane ride in 1919, paying, I think, $5 was the ride, which was hugely expensive back then. But immediately he quit 8th grade, quit school, became an airplane mechanic, and then over the next decade and a half, he barnstormed, flight instructed his way around the Midwest. Ended up in Indiana in 1927, where he designed, built, and flew his own aircraft, tested them. And then later on went to World War II. He was too old, at the whopping age of 35, to fly for the service, so he flew for the China National Aviation Corporation and was lost over the hump in 1943, flying between India and China over the Himalayas. The reason I bring it up is just kind of where my passion came from, because my grandmother, his younger sister, just talked about it nonstop and kind of led our family and down this aviation pathway, if you will. So when I was growing up, like many of you, probably had some sort of drive and push and passion that got you to where you're at today. It was the same for me. Grew up in Indiana. People, as a teenager, asked me, what are you going to do? Well, I was pretty decent at math. I loved aviation, so aeronautical engineering was kind of the default here. And it wasn't until I was into my freshman year that I decided that I loved my classes, but I wanted to maybe be more on the operations side. So I went to Chauncey Hill. The Air Force recruiting station was there. I don't know if it is to this day, but it was in 1998 at least, and told them I wanted to go to the Air Force Academy. I wanted to fly fighters. He kind of told me to pump the brakes, asked if I had heard of this thing called ROTC, and which I had no idea what he was talking about, but sent me over, made a phone call, and I rode my bike back over to the ROTC armory there and signed up for classes, and kind of the rest is history. So it's very like a circuitous route on how I got here, but I think, it's propelled me throughout my career and kept me very active and engaged in this kind of work. And we'll talk about a little bit of that there at the end. But anyway, after graduation in 2001, I ended up flying, as she said, F-15s there for a few years. And then in 2009, wanted to combine that, aeronautical engineering and flying aspect, and went to Air Force Test Pilot School. And that's what I'll talk about testing, for this presentation. But just to quickly here talk about tests. So people kind of ask, what does it look like a day in the life of a test pilot? And that's kind of just like any field that depends on a lot of factors. On one end of the spectrum, there's experimental aircraft that, the engineers have spent years developing, but at some point in time that needs to be test flown. So a test pilot and the flight test team need to work to develop the test plan, how you're going to safely and effectively determine the performance, the flying qualities, the mission suitability of that aircraft. And this gentleman here, named is Sam Ekholm, he was a public affairs officer in the United States Air Force for 5 years, and a couple years ago he got out of the Air Force, started a content creation business here, and now he reaches millions of followers. He's graciously allowed me to play this video, but he did a 30-minute kind of expose on Inside the Air Force Test Pilot School. It's kind of a shameless plug for TPS, and also just to let many people know, Test Pilot School, pilot is in the name. However, 50% of the students that go through Test Pilot School are not pilots. They are engineers primarily. So, and there's a lot of, every year or every class, so every 6 months, there's one civilian engineer that goes through Air Force Test Pilot School as well. And of course, there are civilian test pilot schools. So if you want to get into the operations side, please talk to me afterwards. But this is kind of a look at Test Pilot School.
A-firm, flyby tower is ready.
Downward flyby 450.
Altitude, pull up, pull up.
That's our Top Gun moment for sure, I think.
It's an experience, definitely, that breaks you down, but you all get built back up together, and it's a beautiful thing to watch.
We're taking experienced aviators and engineers and teaching them how to fly anything.
Whether we put it on a spacecraft or an aircraft is kind of immaterial. The science behind it is the same.
I'm I'm here in the Mojave Desert at Edwards Air Force Base to find out what it takes to become one of the world's most skilled pilots. This is where aviation history was rewritten, where the sound barrier was first shattered, where the space shuttle first flew, and where the limits of what's possible continue to be pushed to new heights. I'll be bringing you along to see how test pilots are trained, what makes this school so prestigious, and at the end of it all, I'll be gearing up for a backseat ride in an F-16 Viper to experience real test pilot maneuvers. So strap in and get ready, because this is an inside look at the Air Force's elite test pilot school.
What it takes to get into the test pilot school, the bar is very, very high.
The hardest part about test pilot school is doing all the things at once.
We are getting through a 2-year master's and a 1-year flying program in 12 months.
They are, without question, the best of the best.
So that's obviously, you know, a cool dramatized look at test pilot school, but kind of a few of the pieces in there that that are takeaways is the combination of, you know, academics and flying program, and that'll be one of the lessons learned that I'll talk about is, you know, as a test pilot, I feel like I'm living between two worlds of the traditional pilot side who's operating that aircraft on a dark and stormy night, and the engineers that are part of the team developing that aircraft. So I try to speak the same language. You know, I worked on the F-16, which it's been flying around for, you know, 35 years or something when I started flying it. So it wasn't new and experimental, but putting new weapons, new systems on that aircraft, and then, you know, safety systems that I'll talk to here in a moment were something that's just equally as challenging. So we kind of, instead of, you know, talking about, hey, I'm a traditional pilot or anything, I feel like more if you remember back in the day, it came out, I think, when I was at Purdue, the movie Office Space, that guy who takes the requirements between the customer and the engineers so they don't have to talk to each other. That's kind of what I feel my test pilot job is at times, is speaking both languages to various people in the groups. But what I'll talk to primarily here is the program near dear to my heart, the F-16 Automatic Ground Collision Avoidance System. So I was kind of the lead test pilot for approximately 9 to 12 months or something in 2011, but the program is actually fairly old. It was started developed in the mid-'80s as a way to put as much automation into fighter aircraft as possible, primarily to enhance the effectiveness of that aircraft. So we're talking weapons delivery, things like that. GCAS kind of spawned out of that as a safety system to help the test program mitigate risk. But through decades of development, and finally they decided to actually put it on the aircraft. So I was involved in the final development piece between 2010 and 2012 for fielding on the F-16 in 2014. So all Block 40 and Block 50 F-16 aircraft in the U.S. Air Force were fielded with this system. And it's fairly simple technology. So you have a digital terrain database that you see up there that is a latitude and longitude coordinate with an elevation at each point over the globe. And then the aircraft obviously knows where it's at. It's got a navigation solution, primarily GPS. It also knows its state, attitude, airspeed, things like that. Through that data, it can predict a trajectory, and it's doing that constantly. And that trajectory prediction is assuming that at an instant in time, the F-16 is rolling to a wings level attitude and doing a 5G pull-up until it starts a climb. And when that trajectory prediction meets that DTED data, you know, where there is dirt over the Earth, it will send a signal to the flight control computer to actually initiate that auto GCAS maneuver because it deems that you're about to hit the ground. And then it'll do the fly up and hopefully save the aircraft from hitting the ground. So, kind of automation is an interesting topic. We actually talked about this last Friday at another speaking engagement. But, you know, we've constantly had automation over the last over half a century on aircraft, and it's kind of getting more and more widespread. But usually the human is the backup, right? If something goes poorly in the automation of the aircraft, the human will be a backup to safely fly and land the airplane. When you're flying on an airliner, there's an autopilot and autothrottle, and 99.9% of the time those are probably engaged when you're on there. But if those fail, the pilot can hand fly the airplane. You also now, as automation has proliferated into flight control systems, you actually see it start to bound the pilot. So we have angle of attack limiters, G limiters, specifically on the F-16, that'll allow you to not put the aircraft out of control or not overstress the aircraft. You have stability and augmentation systems to make the aircraft fly better. But this is one of those rare systems where it actually will take control away from the pilot to put the aircraft from an unsafe to a safe state, and then give the control back to the pilot when it deems that it is back safe again. And so testing a safety system like that is pretty weird, right? So this system only works if you're literally about to crash the airplane. So how do you test a system like that? You try to mitigate, like any system, whether you're testing a weapon, or radar or safety system, you mitigate as much risk as possible. And that's why we go to test pilot school, is try to figure out ways to reduce the risk of the people on board the airplane and the asset itself. After that, you try to understand the system and increase the trust of that system as much as possible, so you can go out there and actually do more risky tests. And you just have to either accept that or not accept it because it's too risky. So for this program, what we did was just like anything else. You start off, you do as much software testing as possible to make sure the system's working, in a lab on a computer. Then you implement hardware components of that, so now that actually might be connected to hydraulic actuators and things, and make sure that the flight control system's doing what you think it's going to do. Finally, you put it in a sim with a pilot in the simulator, and you do hundreds, if not thousands, of runs against the ground to make sure the auto GCAS program is taking over when it should and flying the correct profile. Now, we had the luxury during this system to have kind of a sister safety system called the Pilot Activated Recovery System. And in that, called PARS, it actually had a button in the cockpit where if the pilot recognized that they were spatially disoriented, so they were discombobulated, didn't know which way was up, it was night, in the weather, something to that effect, you could push the button and the aircraft would automatically take control and put you in a wings level, straight level attitude. Well, with that system, if you were nose low, pointed at the ground when you push that button, it would execute the exact same maneuver that auto GCAS would execute. So we were able to, confirm the performance model of that GCAS maneuver up at a safer altitude and get a little more trust in the system. And then finally, we had the ability in the test program to add a vertical buffer to that DTED file, 1,000, 2,000 feet. Give us a little bit of wiggle room so that when the aircraft was diving at the ground, it thought it was about to hit the ground, but really it was still 1,000, 2,000 feet higher than what the actual terrain was. So, but at some point in time, you still have to test the jet, right? And you have to fly aggressively, low level, pointing at the ground. We never ask our pilots to actually, try to collide with the ground, obviously. But the objectives at that test program were to first make sure you did no harm, right? You didn't want a safety system that caused more crashes than what it prevented. Secondly, the reason it was developed. So flying aggressive low levels allowed us to ensure that it wasn't that nuisance-prone system. But the next video will show you that obviously it was a success story, or we wouldn't be talking about it today. But give you a quick, just show you, it was fielded in 2014, and by 2016, this was the 4th time it had saved a pilot's life. So this is a heads-up display of an F-16. If you look on the left side, you see the airspeed indicator. It's a tape, but 481 is not calibrated airspeed. At the top there, I think it has 3.0. That's the current G that the pilot is flying. Underneath SIM, 0.97, that's the Mach number, so he's just subsonic. 5.7 is the maximum G they've pulled on that flight. On the right-hand side, you've got altitude, 17,240, that is feet above sea level, with the R, 15,940 being the radar altimeter, so the height above the ground. You see a horizon line, 5, 10 degree pitch ladders, both up and down. You'll also hear the intercom of the pilot. You'll hear him breathing, grunting, and then you'll hear a radio transmission from another airplane. Because this aircraft, they're doing 1-versus-1 basic fighter maneuvers, which, if you've seen the movie Top Gun, it's dogfighting, just visual with each other, pulling a lot of Gs. At some point in time, you'll see the pilot pull a lot of Gs, get fairly nose low, and then the Gs will lessen. It'll go back to almost 1 G. The breathing will lessen, and it's because the pilot's passed out. He's actually had a G-induced loss of consciousness, which is why it just starts pointing at the ground at a very high rate of speed. You'll see arrows come in from the side of the heads-up display. When those two touch, you'll see fly up written in the middle of the HUD. That means the auto GCAS system is taken over, and now it's flying the airplane.
Fuel recover. Fuel recover. Fuel recover. Fuel recover. Scully, knock it off. Scully 1, knock it off.
Scully 2, knock it off.
2, get yourself back above the floor.
So pretty scary, but the success of the F-16 led to it being fielded on the F-22, the F-35, the Swedish Gripen, and I just heard that they're thinking about now, I think it should be fielded on the Legacy F-18s in the Navy and the Marines. So, but there's still a lot of work to do. There's a lot of aircraft in the DoD specifically that don't have this on there. And outside of the Department of Defense as well. It was on the cover of Aviation Week, Space Technology a few times, and it ended up winning with the F-35, the 2018 Collier Trophy. So fairly successful program, but the biggest thing was the number of lives that it saved. If you take a look at the chart here, this is from 1990 to 2023, the F-16 in the Air Force CFIT history, or controlled flight into terrain. Between 1990 and 2013, essentially, the Air Force was losing about 1 2/3 pilots a year. And then in 2014, when GCAS was fielded, it saved 12 jets and 13 lives, at least up until 2023. And I'm unsure of the count over the last 2 years. But so, it's great to do this for the Department of Defense, but there's issues outside the Department of Defense also. For those of you interested in aeronautical engineering, aviation, those things, the NTSB reports that Part 135 operators, it's the second leading cause of fatalities is the controlled flight in terrain, and then general aviation, it is the third leading cause. So. In fact, a study done in 2023, 110 fatalities per year were found to be preventable with a suitable ground collision avoidance system. So that's kind of one of these things that you see a lot of technology, go both ways, from commercial over to the Department of Defense and then Department of Defense back over to commercial. And this is one thing that I think it could go towards the commercial operation. This is actually just a simulator of a group that I'm working with now that are trying to provide a system for general aviation pilots that you can put just like an app on your phone. And give you kind of different maneuvers that can still be safe and get you out of trouble into some sort of terrain. So you can see here it's showing you that straight ahead is not going to work, even though the pilot's continuing to try. But you still have a left and a right turn, and eventually those turns will go away sequentially to the point where it'll say you no longer have any other options. It'll give a lift vector, a dot to pull up to, and set a power setting. It's interesting. One lesson learned for me here, the reason I got involved in this program after retirement was from the connections that I made as working on the auto GCAS system in the DoD with different engineers. So it is a small world, but just give a few kind of, don't mean to be too cliche, but lessons learned that I've had working on this auto GCAS program. First of all, I was working in teams. As a student here, I don't know if you feel the same way, but group projects were my least favorite thing. I think I was arrogant enough to think, I would rather control my own destiny by myself, and I don't have to deal with the normal friction of 4 or 5 humans working together. Unfortunately, that's not going to be how you're going to work most likely in the industry. And I'm glad that Purdue forces that upon students. I also had the added benefit of getting forced to do leadership and teamwork training in ROTC and in the military. But I think the individuals that kind of maximize that ability to a team dynamic is who are going to be successful. Everything that I've seen out there is how that is going to play out. So kind of force yourself to be more involved in those kind of settings. Secondly, just working in teams for this auto GCAS program, for the execution side, when I took over as a lead test pilot, it was a very small team. that we're working on a daily basis. Myself and maybe 4 or 5 engineers. I was 31 and I was the oldest one there. So you end up being, put in a leadership position very early on a pretty significant program. So realize though that the foundations that you get here at Purdue, especially coming to settings like this, you're obviously interested and have a stake in the ground, so that'll serve you well. And just realize that you are prepared for that task. It just may not seem like it at a younger age. Second little saying here by science fiction author, but actually he's an aeronautical engineer too, and I didn't know that until finding this out, was Robert Heinlein, who wrote in one of his novels, Specialization is for Insects. And I'm not trying to say that you shouldn't specialize. Obviously, I have multiple degrees in one specialty, so I have no room to talk. But my point is that, the people who can kind of take a look at the bigger picture, especially in a team setting, who can understand multiple avenues of the technical aspects of a program, the operational aspects, maybe the programmatics, the big picture goals, those are ones that seem like they're most successful. Now, you still need specialties, but that team leadership and integration is definitely invaluable for people like that. For the Auto GCAS program, I'll say we had a flight test engineer on the program who, he had a bachelor's and master's degree in aeronautical engineering, specialty in flight controls, flight dynamics, but he had a private pilot's license. He could do software with the best of them as well. So he was the person that kind of would translate, kind of like that Office Space meme that I talked about, between myself and the software engineers, because I would see something on a test card that they wanted to get me to do this specific maneuver, and I'd ask them, well, why do you want me to do that? What data are you specifically looking for? And then they would answer in some language that was kind of English, but it definitely wasn't pilot speak. And then I would have that person kind of be the interpreter between the two of us on what does exactly he mean, and that software guy would be wondering the same thing when I said something, angle of attack or, pulling G's, something to that effect. So very important, again, I think, to have a breadth of knowledge and get that foundation as early as possible, but be lifelong learners. I know if I had to do it all over again, I even cringe a little bit to say this, but just from my own background, but I would have taken maybe a communication or an English class or something more than what I was mandated, because that will also serve you very well, and it'll be just important as some of the other 500 level courses in your specialty. All right, this other quote, the perfect is the enemy of the good. So seems pretty odd speaking like that on a safety system or any system. I think this can translate to really any program that you may work on in the future. And I don't mean to say that we weren't trying to make Auto GCAS a 100% perfect solution, but there were other constraints that were causing us not to be able to do that. So you have to understand at some point in time, the 99% solution is probably good enough, and to go from 99 to 100%, it'll be an unproportional amount of effort to get there. And you probably won't be able to anyway for time, funding, expertise, labor, some sort of constraint that can prevent you from doing the full program that you want to do. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. At some point in time in the Auto GCAS program, we realize every year that this gets delayed, that's 1 or 2 more people that die. So it's best just to get something out there that will probably save 99% of them than to continue to perfect this solution that will eventually never happen. So, all right, final just a couple takeaways for you students out there, and please ask questions afterwards, but just say that I'm kind of somewhat jealous, besides coming back to Purdue, but also, the air and space industry right now is amazing. You've got these, in the military itself, the rise of combat autonomy is something that I think is exciting a lot of people in the military. With the collaborative combat aircraft, and General Alvin, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, seems like his quote is, we're kind of acting like we're all in on that stuff. We've both got the Anduril and also General Atomics aircraft both having first flight, so that's a pretty neat future. And I think the Air Force actually meets at this time. From a commercial aspect, you still have the integration of unmanned aircraft systems in the NAS, advanced air mobility, and there's a lot of money being put into that. So when you combine that with space, what Dr. Moser just talked about, kind of the proliferation of satellites in low Earth orbit and small satellites. We've heard from other people talking about extraplanetary exploration. So all of these new, quote, new areas, plus all the traditional roles in aerospace right now, there's a ton of work out there. I know we were talking about that before the brief here about once you get into the industry, you'll probably get emails and phone calls from other people wanting to pull you in 50 different directions. There's just more work out there than there's competent people to do that. So with Purdue now on your resume, you'll be one of those people that will have a certain level of expectation when you get there. I should just hold this, maybe. I think. And then finally, this is just me as a dad talking, I think. Life is a marathon, not a sprint. It's a cliche, I understand, but that doesn't mean it's not true. Hopefully you're eager. Treat this as like mini 5Ks that you take a break for a little bit and then do another 5K as you get out into the workforce. So it's a very exciting time. I hope you're all excited to get out there. That wasn't the most national defense discussion of all time, but there's a lot of those, I think, traits that talk about the Auto GCAS program and kind of the lessons learned that can be applied to anything. But I'll close for now and love to answer any questions about this or about something totally random that you heard in my bio also. I'm going to pass it back.
Thank you. A round of applause for Lieutenant Colonel Abel, please. What questions do you all have?
Okay, I loved your talk, and then as a pilot, how do you think your input regarding the system that you worked on, like what valuable inputs do you think you had that might have been otherwise missed?
Can you rephrase that?
Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah.
Like would have been otherwise, well, let me answer it and I'll see if I answered your question. I mean, I think as a test pilot, I kind of talked about we live in between two worlds, but in that test team, we kind of are representing the pilot that's going to be the end user of the system, no matter what that system is. So, and that's what they're designing the system for. Not to say the pilots know better than the engineers on how to design or develop a system, but they're the ones that are going to be using it. So I think our inputs, using our pilot side of our brain, to say, hey, if we do it this way, pilots are going to hate it, or they're not going to use it, or something to that effect, is really giving those pilot comments because, that's why we're developing the system. We're not just developing it for an engineering exercise or something to that effect. But then I think it's important that we have to understand, both sides of that to be able to make those decisions and not be a stalemate. Did that answer your question? Okay.
Any other questions? Much has been remarked about the struggles of the United States for these large procurement programs, building things in general. As someone who implemented one of these large programs that has been hugely impactful in the United States Air Force, what would you say your takeaways would be for government leaders as we go into this new cycle of large ambitious projects like Golden Dome, the AI build-out, the nuclear build-out, all these sorts of things? What would you say government leaders and industry leaders can take from your experience being successful in a large program?
Yeah, I mean, first I'll just back up on my part of that program was a very small part, so I wasn't making top-level decisions, and the program was essentially funded by the time I got involved. But I have seen, it's not a surprise or a secret that people get frustrated with the acquisition process over its history. I think what I've learned, being that on that other side, also being frustrated at times, is that if you really want to make an impact or move the football a little bit, it's coming with the data, not emotions, to talk to a leader that can have some sort of impact. Because if you just say, hey, we should do it this way because they're going to, everybody has their own priorities, and that person's might not be aligned with yours. But if you continuously hit them with data that shows them the impact and make a case that you should care about this because we lose, 1 2/3 pilots plus, not that should be a secondary reason. We lose $50 million with the 1 2/3 airplanes every year. So this will save money in the end very quickly. Those kind of things is what I would suggest.
Other questions? Okay, I've actually got one.
Yeah.
So one thing that I've got through my own experience with tests and working with Cinco, as you know, is he talks about justified confidence a lot. And as a pilot, I think you might have touched on this a little bit. I think pilots there's a certain attitude in the flying world of like, I'm good enough. What do I need this extra thing for? Like, I'll just handle it. So when it came to implementation of GCAS or any really augmenting system that supports the pilot in a way that might, infringe upon that ego of like, oh, I got this, I don't need this help. What are the challenges that you anticipate or experienced in that process?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point because, yes, I have noticed maybe some pilots have egos and sometimes don't like automation affecting their abilities. But kind of a couple things. First of all, I think, the data, eventually, if you hit them over the head enough with data, they will start to come around. I think there's a generational thing and just a humans as we progress, as we step and march through time, automation is becoming a bigger part of the rest of our lives, not just in the flying world. So when people start accepting automation at home on their way to work, those sort of things, I think that resistance to automation is going to continually to eat away at it. Now, it'll never be perfect. And I don't think it's a bad thing that we push back to some degree on it because there's the opposite end of the spectrum where we see a lot of hype and promises of things that are going to happen by 2027. And sure enough, I'll bet man that it's not going to happen by 2027. Yeah, right. But I think those two factors is if you actually show through data how that can help. And also, I think times are changing, and I think we're kind of at that hump in the road where we see collaborative combat aircraft now as a program of record or as a program that is being accepted, I think, anecdotally, by a lot of pilots in the Air Force. So I think that's a good thing.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any other questions before we close out? In that case, we can't thank you enough for your time today, and as well, Dr. Moser. There's a tradition in the military-affiliated circles called challenge coins, which is where you pass off on the end. So we would like to thank you for your time. This is from the NDS Week committee, so we appreciate you for your time, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.